What I'd like to do today is use this time to simply introduce my plans for these weekly history classes and what I'd like for us to do live, because there's a lot that we can do in an online course, and these live class meetings are never going to replace the online courses, because you've all got to do individual studies to master the content, and you have to do that at your own pace. So I'm never going to try to replace that with scheduled classes, because that defeats the whole point of online studies and the benefits of homeschooling. But what I'm going to do is, in these weekly live classes, provide you with some resources and information that I can't possibly get into a printed lesson or an online course, because it's too complicated and it would make lessons too messy. So I'll save all of this kind of stuff for these live classes, and I think you'll find them very helpful with studying history. And let me just give you some background about history studies. On the board behind me, you might see that I wrote, history has two different parts. There's two different studies that make up the study of history. The first is chronology, and the second is geography. Chronology is the study of time and when things take place. Geography is the study of the earth and where things take place. So we've got two different parts of the study of history. And if you don't learn both of them, you can never understand history. So we've got to learn both chronology and geography. And in the academy, you know that we've got different courses. One course teaches chronology, another course may teach geography. Then there are some history courses which will explain both. But it's very hard to study history, because you have to study both chronology and geography. And it's hard to study both of these subjects. It's especially hard to study geography. The reason why I say it's hard to study geography is because we can make easy geography courses where you study maps, you learn the names of places, you learn the names of rivers and things like that. But it's really not helpful to study map geography when you're studying history, because it doesn't give you any of the information that you actually need to understand history. I'll give you an example. When I was a classroom teacher, we always used to teach geography because I taught history classes. We would use maps and things like that, and the students would have to look at a sheet of paper with a map drawn on it, and they would have to learn where different cities are, different mountain ranges, different rivers and oceans and things like that. And that knowledge it's helpful, gets useless, because it doesn't really tell you what's important about those places and why those places are important in history. In order to understand why, you either have to visit those places, which obviously is too expensive. We can't make our knowledge of history dependent on our ability to travel everywhere. That would be very expensive, and very few people would be able to do it. So we can't rely on travel. The second best thing we can do is watch videos and look at photos. When we look at photos of different places and watch videos, video tours and things like that, we can start to learn what's actually important about different places and why they were important historically. So, for example, when God told Abraham that he was going to give him the land of Canaan, why does that matter, right? Why would anyone want the land of Canaan? Why was Egypt always very wealthy? What allowed them to be wealthy? Why was Athens where it was? Why was Troy where it was? Why was Babylon, the city of Babylon, why was that where it was? Why did an empire build around the ancient city of Nineveh? Why did the Romans choose to build their city where they did? There's all these questions about why. And you can't answer the why questions unless you understand the geography, because usually the reason why people did things where they did them, when they did them, was because of the place itself. And, you can imagine when your parents, think about the house you live in. If I were to ask you, why did your parents choose to live where you live? Why did they choose to build the house where they built the house? Why does your house face the direction that it faces? All of those questions are going to be answered by geography. And geography really explains all the details of why things take place, but only if we study geography in a 3D kind of way. Looking at maps doesn't really help us. We have to look at things 3D. So when I was a school teacher, what I did for my students was I collected photographs. I collected tons of photographs that showed different places in a way that allowed them to see the place in a 3D perspective, where they could really see what made different places special. And I collected all these pictures, and it was very difficult for me to share the pictures. I had to put them on overhead projectors and things. And it was just very clumsy and difficult. It was always difficult. When the internet developed, all of a sudden things started to change because of one invention, and I'll share it with you here. One invention changed the teaching of geography forever, and it's Google Earth. Because for the first time in human history, we can do this. We can travel around the whole entire world and visit every different place from the comfort of our own desk, from our own living room. We can go visit the Nile Delta. We can travel from the Nile Delta up and go visit Jerusalem and look at the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee. We can go visit Mesopotamia. We can travel to Mesopotamia and go visit the ancient city of Babylon. We can visit the Himalayan mountains out in China. We can go to the east, travel through India, go out to China. We can visit the Himalayan mountains. All these different things. Sorry, I'm not even close. Here they are out here. So we can travel the whole world and go anywhere we want for the study of geography and history. And we can go in detail by zooming in on these places, and we can enjoy 3D perspectives of all of these places, which no one could ever do in the history of the world. If we want to study Rome, we can go visit Rome. We can go right down into the 3D landscape and visit Rome as people would have actually visited it in the ancient world. They would have sailed up to the location, sailed into the river Tiber here from the Mediterranean Sea, and they would have traveled up the Tiber River until they came to the location of the city. No one could ever study history like this and understand all these things. But for us, this is all very simple because of technology. And you can see that there's no way that I can put this in a course. You can't put this in a textbook. You can't put this in an online lesson. But in a live class, as we go through history, we can study all of this stuff very easily by using the technology that's available to us. And it's stuff like this that I'd like to do. Sorry, let me let some more people in here. It's stuff like this that I'd like to do through live classes, to share resources and take you for tours as we go through different events in history, so that you can understand why these events took place, when they took place, why these different places are significant, and so on. So geography can be studied today in a way that it could never be studied in the history of the world. And most geography teachers, most history teachers don't make use of these tools. They teach it in a boring 2D textbook way, but I'd like for us to use these tools and enjoy some of the lessons that we can learn by using Google Earth and all of this mapping technology that's available to us. So in our live classes, we're going to be doing stuff like this. We're going to walk through world history. We're going to take our time and walk through it, event by event, civilization by civilization, just going along with the online courses that you're already studying. But we're going to go into some details and look at some things that I could never include in an online lesson because it would be too complicated, too messy, and so on. So what I'd like to do is help you to learn chronology, when things take place, and I'd also like to help you learn geography, where things took place and why that's important, and how it helps us to understand not only what happened in the past, but why things are still going on today. For example, if you look at the news and you learn about Russia and Ukraine, and you find Ukraine on the map, here's Ukraine, and then Russia is this entire continent up here. And I know it may be confusing to look at because I'm just spinning the globe around, but here's a little better look. Here's Ukraine, and this entire continent up here is Russia. And you might ask, why in the world would that giant continent or that giant country of Russia, why would they be interested in Ukraine, this country down here? And it's hard to understand that when you're watching the news or just, looking at a map or a textbook. But if we zoom in, we'll find that Russia isn't able to connect to the Black Sea down here. But if it could take over this part of Ukraine right here in the east of Ukraine, Russia would be able to extend all the way down to the Black Sea. And that's what makes that land so valuable for Russia, why they want that land. And so when you get into the geography, you can understand what's going on and why it's going on. It's because of this river that runs through Ukraine that separates Western from Eastern Ukraine. Russia would love to own this land on the east side of this river and gain access to the Black Sea down here. That's why that land is so valuable to Russia. They're not just picking on Ukraine because they're bored. They're interested in a certain area of land for all the benefits that it makes available. And that's how all history works. That's how all wars work. That's why civilizations develop in different places and so on. It's all dependent on geography, and we need a way to study geography that allows us to see these things. And these tools allow us to see it. Let's take another look. Why was Egypt always so wealthy in the ancient world? Well, you can see that a river came down to the area where the Egyptians lived. And where did it come from? It came all the way down in Central or Southern Africa. If we go down to Central Africa, we find this giant lake. And this lake is up in the mountains. You can't tell that by looking at a flat map. But when we switch into 3D mode, then we can start to see, I don't know if I could do it right now, but we can start to see that these are mountains in Central Africa, and there's a lake, a giant lake in the top of these mountains. Well, that lake starts to drain from those mountains and runs downhill, and that drains downhill all the way through Africa, all the way northward through Africa until it finally empties into the Mediterranean Sea. So all of that water that drains through Africa all runs through the land of Egypt, and the Egyptian people could sit there at the bottom of this river, just letting all of this water come down through all of Africa, and they enjoyed this beautiful, prosperous, fertile area of land in the middle of a giant desert. So if you look at this area, on the west, it's all desert. On the east, it's all desert. In the north, there's a giant sea that no one can get across. And so this civilization was able to develop, and it didn't even need good weather. It didn't need rain for its crops. Everything came automatically because of the Nile River. And so Egypt was established as a great ancient civilization because of the Nile River. It didn't have to worry about being invaded because it was surrounded by desert. No one could invade them. If someone was going to invade by sea, all that Egypt needed to do was guard the seaports. So it was very easy to keep safe, and it was supplied by a constant flow of water that flooded every year, fertilized all the crops, and Egypt was always very wealthy. How about Babylon? Why was Babylon important? Well, if you go over to the east, you find that there were two great rivers. These two great rivers started up in the mountains. They start up in these mountains near Turkey today in Asia Minor, and these two great rivers flow southward, and they drain into this gulf down here. So two great rivers travel through these lands, And they create, in the midst of all of this desert, they create this giant fertile valley in between the two rivers. And what do we call that land between the two rivers? What's the name for that land? Some of you study chronology. What's the name of that land, this fertile land between the two rivers? Yeah, MES is a good beginning. What's it called? What's that land called? The land between the two rivers. I know some of you have to know it. There you go, Mesopotamia. Good. What does the word Mesopotamia mean? What does it mean? What does Mesopotamia mean? What does that word mean? Between the two rivers. Very good. And we can see, if we look at it, this giant desert area. And remember, deserts are good for civilizations because they provide protection. You can't lead an army across a desert to invade a city. So if you can be in the midst of a desert or surrounded by mountains, but at the same time have fertile soil, you can have a great civilization. And in this land, this area between the rivers here, this area allowed people to live in a place surrounded by deserts and mountains with fertile soil provided by these rivers. And the name for this land is simply the land between the two rivers. And ancient Assyrian civilization developed in this place, and ancient Babylonian civilization developed in this place. So when we zoom back out, we see one great civilization developed in Egypt, one great civilization developed in the land between the two rivers out in the east. And that's really where civilization still focuses today, unless people discovered other areas where they were able to settle. And, technology allows us to settle in different places. So there's a reason why things happen where they happen in history. There's a reason why certain cities will always be great, even if God wills and we live for another 2,000 years on earth, the same places will still be great in 2,000 years that were great 2,000 years ago, because they're just great locations based on their geography. So when we get into the geography, it explains a lot of the events. It may be choppy just because it's a lot of data, so just bear with it. I can't control your internet connection speeds, so hopefully the video, though, won't be choppy. So you can always watch it again in the video, and the video will probably depend more on my internet speed, which is very good, so it shouldn't be a problem in the video. But anyway, what I want to do in these history classes, these live history classes, is study chronology, talk about the events and the order of the events, so you get a framework in your mind of when things took place. And then I'd like to spend a lot of time going through geography to allow you to see where it took place and why it took place, where it did take place. So that's what I'd like to do in these meetings. Most of you are probably in the World Chronology course, which is great. So we'll go through that content, maybe explain things in a little more detail than the lessons have for us. Some of you are enrolled in the high school level World History course, which covers the same events, but in more detail. So it'll serve both of those courses, and history courses can go on forever in the Academy because we've got a number of history courses that go from simple world chronology all the way into really detailed history studies. You'll see that there's a list of studies. I'll go show you real quick. On the study center, if you go down to the humanities section, all the way down to humanities. Oh, I passed it. Hold on a minute. Down in the humanities, we've got world chronology up at the top, and then world geography. Those are the two basic courses in history. But then we go down to the high school level, and we've got 300 level world history. We've got American history, American government. And then we get into the 400 level, and you've got this list of courses: ancient history, classical history 1, 2, and 3, medieval history 1, 2, and 3, modern history. So you can see that in the academy, history studies can go on forever if you're interested in studying history. And I plan to meet weekly to study history, and we'll just continue to go through it as far as you're interested in going. So starting from world chronology, going through geography and into the high school level courses, we'll just keep going through history, and we can take our time. We can move quickly through more boring periods or boring events, and we can take our time to really dig into more interesting events like Roman history and Greek history and things like that. So these live classes allow us to have a lot of flexibility that we can't have in an online course. So that's what I plan to do. As far as chronology, we're going to work from the chronology timeline, which all of you should be familiar with. If you don't know about this chronology timeline, if you go to the World Chronology course, and all of you are subscribers, so you can add any of these courses that you'd like, just use the enrollment key subscriber. If you add the World Chronology course, you can get this timeline. It's right at the top of the chronology page. And I recommend that you print a copy of it and just keep it stuck in a binder or on your desk or on a bulletin board where you study. Keep it where you can always see it, because we're going to refer to this timeline all the time as we go through history studies and discuss things. Now, the reason why chronology is so important is not just because I want you to be a bunch of history nerds that know a lot of trivia. That's not the point. It's not just for us to gather trivia and be able to talk about these things. There's actually a really important reason why you need to know chronology. It's very important for life. And the reason is because when you know the chronology of events, even though you don't know the details of different people or places in history, if you know these events in chronology and you simply reason about them, you can figure out all kinds of important stuff that you need to figure out day by day in your studies. For example, let's say that Aristotle he really discovered the art of logic or reasoning. Aristotle discovered that art. Before Aristotle, no one understood the art of reasoning. It was unknown. It was like how today we can say no one knows the cure for cancer. But one day someone may find a cure for cancer, and then after that, everyone will know the cure for cancer. But before that, no one knew the cure for cancer. So before Aristotle, no one understood the art of logic. When did Aristotle live? You can either look at this timeline, if you can read it. I'll scroll down a little bit, or up actually. You can look at the timeline to find when Aristotle lived, or you can just let me know because you actually already know the date. When did Aristotle live? When did Aristotle live? Who can tell me? When did Aristotle live? 384 BC. Good. That was when he was born. So he was born in 384 BC. And when did he die? What year did he die? 322. Good. Okay, so he died 322 BC. So he lived from 384 to 322. Now, what that tells us is that no one who lived before then knew the art of reasoning. There were wise men who lived before then, but they weren't wise because they knew the art of reasoning. They were wise for other reasons. For example, Moses was wise because he did study philosophies, ancient philosophy, but God also revealed things to Moses. Solomon was wise, but God revealed things to Solomon. So most of the men in the ancient world who were wise, they were wise because of their experience or because God actually revealed things to them. So that's how ancient people became wise. But after Aristotle, men were able to become much wiser through the study of reasoning and philosophy because Aristotle discovered the art of reasoning. That's important for you to always remember when you study ancient philosophy. You can be studying the writings of a philosopher, and if he lived before Aristotle, he didn't know the art of reasoning. And I'll give you a surprising example. A surprising example of an ancient philosopher who didn't know the art of reasoning was Socrates. Socrates lived a century before Aristotle. Socrates didn't know the art of reasoning. It was developed by Aristotle 100 years later. So there's lots that we can think about when we just meditate on chronology. If you just think about chronology, you can understand why things are as they were, why things were done the way they were done, why people believed what they believe, why people taught what they taught, and so on. Chronology helps you to understand that. Then we have the life of Jesus Christ, which is another major event. Jesus Christ, it's actually hard to talk about when Jesus Christ lived because he lived around 0, which is awkward to try to explain and think about. But Jesus Christ lives, and Jesus Christ reveals things to the human race that were mysteries that couldn't possibly be known. So human knowledge in the world changes after, let's say, 33 AD, when the church is established. So the church is established at the end of the life of Christ in 33 AD there. And after 33 AD, everything is different because the Holy Spirit is given to men through the sacraments in the church. And all of a sudden, learning is very different when the Holy Spirit is involved in our thinking and studying and learning. And there's, all sorts of men who are filled with gifts of the Holy Spirit that help them to learn. So we have the apostles who write the New Testament for us. That changes everything in the world. We've got the church fathers who are answering ancient questions with the help of new Christian teaching. That changes everything in the world. And then another major event takes place down in the 1200s, down in around 1270, when a man named St. Thomas Aquinas accomplishes something where he joins together the theology or teaching of the Catholic Church with the philosophy of Aristotle. He brings those two things together and creates what's called Scholastic Philosophy. And after that, everything changes. There's another major change. And that goes on for a few hundred years. And then in the 1600s, down here, we have the scientific revolution. A man named Francis Bacon writes a book called The New Organon and introduces the idea of the scientific method, which rejects Aristotelian philosophy, and a whole new system of thinking develops, which we call modern science today. And everything after 1620 is different. So we've got these major events in world history. And if all that we know about chronology are those 4 or 5 major events, we can immediately start to think about things that we read about. So for example, if I am talking about the book of Proverbs in the Bible, who can tell me when the book of Proverbs was written? When was the book of Proverbs in the Bible written? When was that written? Anybody have an idea? It's okay if you take an intelligent guess. Don't take a wild, crazy guess if you have no idea. But if you've got a decent idea about when it might have been put together, when was the book of Proverbs written? 960 BC. Very good. Very good. 960 BC. Good. Okay. 960 because we know that they were written by Solomon, and that's when Solomon lived. So good. So again, you can see how chronology helps you to think about things. So if you sit down and you take out your Bible and you open up your Bible and you say, you know what, today I'd like to read the Proverbs. Chronology helps you to realize that you're reading things that were written 950 years before Christ. And you need to think about that when you read those things. Were there scientists in the world when the book of Proverbs was written? Yes or no? Were there scientists with laboratories doing research? And no, there were no scientists. So we have to think, how did Solomon know all the things that he knew? There were no science labs, there were no test tubes, no microscopes, no telescopes. How did he know all those things? How did he know about the things he wrote about? It becomes mysterious, and we've got to ask those questions. Did Solomon know anything about Aristotle when he wrote the Proverbs? Did Solomon know anything about Aristotle? Nope. Did Aristotle know anything about Solomon? Did Aristotle know about Solomon? Yes or no? What do you think? No, yes, no. Some people say no, some people say yes. Let me ask the question a little bit in a better way. Could Aristotle have known about Solomon? Yes or no? Could he have known? Yes, he could have known. All right. Aristotle might have known about Solomon, but Solomon could not have known about Aristotle. So is it possible that some of Solomon's ideas got into Aristotle's philosophy? Yes or no? Is it possible that Solomon's ideas could have gotten into Aristotle's philosophy? Yes, right? Yes, it's possible. So is it possible that some of Aristotle's ideas could have come from God? Yes or no? Yes, it's possible, right? And so you can see how chronology helps us to think about that. If we go before Solomon, even before Moses, there's no divine revelation. There's no scriptures. They start with Moses in the Old Testament. So it's hard to talk about where ideas are coming from before men like Moses live, because that's when the scriptures begin to be put together. But after the scriptures, the knowledge that was in the scriptures started to spread through the whole world. People might not have known where it was coming from, but it was actually coming from the scriptures, and they didn't know that, but they knew that it was true. So they may have accepted it and started teaching it and talking about it and acting upon it, even though they didn't know that it actually came into the world through divine revelation. So once something is revealed or once something is done, it can influence everything that happens after it. And that's why chronology is so important. Is it possible that St. Paul knew about the teaching of Aristotle? Yes or no? Could St. Paul have known about the teaching of Aristotle? Yes. Did St. Paul know about the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas? Yes or no? No, St. Paul couldn't know Aquinas. Did St. Thomas Aquinas know about the teaching of St. Paul? Yes or no? Yes. And so you see how something this simple, just thinking about when different people lived, when different people taught, when different people wrote different books, you can see how important chronology is to help us think about those books, because we can simply think about what different authors knew and didn't know, or could have known or could not have known, and that helps us to rightly interpret these different writings. I'll give you an example. Yesterday, if you joined me for the English literature course, I talked about when Homer wrote. And just real quick, when did Homer write? When did Homer write? 750 BC. Good. 750 BC. Right. So Homer wrote in 750 BC. And I told you that when you read Homer and you read about religious ideas that Homer teaches and things like that, I told you that as a Christian, you shouldn't criticize Homer's teaching about religion. Why not? Why should you not criticize Homer's teaching about religion? Why not? There's two important reasons. Let's see if you can think of some. Why should we not criticize Homer's teaching? He lived a long time ago. That's right. He lived before Christ came into the world. So you can't take Christian teaching and use it as a guide to judge Homer's beliefs about religion. Homer, when God judges Homer, God is not going to judge Homer based on Christian teaching, because Homer could not have known Christian teaching. God is going to judge Homer based on what could have been known when Homer lived. And we should do the same thing. When we read Homer, we should judge him based on when he lived. So it's important for us to know that he lived in 750 BC. Now, let me ask you this. Is it possible, is it possible that Homer knew the 10 Commandments? Is it possible that Homer knew the 10 Commandments? Yes, it is possible, because they were written all the way back in 1400 BC. So the 10 Commandments might have been known to men like Homer. And could God judge Homer based on the 10 Commandments? Yes or no? Could God judge Homer based on the 10 Commandments? Maybe, right? Maybe. So it's possible that Homer knew about the 10 Commandments, but he couldn't have known about the teaching of Aristotle. He couldn't have known about the Trinity or teachings of the Christian church. Could Homer have known the Proverbs of Solomon? Could Homer have known the Proverbs of Solomon? Yes, he could have, right? So when we read Homer, the kind of stuff that we should look for is stuff that makes sense in his time. So we should look for things like the 10 Commandments in the teaching and writing of Homer. We should look to see if the 10 Commandments and the ideas of the 10 Commandments are in Homer, or if Homer says things that go against the 10 Commandments. Those are the things that are important. We should look for the Proverbs of Solomon in the writings of Homer, because they may have been known. So we can look at the Proverbs and then take our knowledge of the Proverbs and bring that into our study of Homer and look for things that Homer writes that relate to the Proverbs of Solomon. So let's see, there's a comment real quick. I just have to follow this. Xavier wrote, I'm thinking about this country-wise in terms of geography, right? So you might think, well, they don't live in the same place, so they didn't know. But didn't men travel? Didn't men trade with other places, right? So ideas could spread. People traveled from different places. People met people from different places, and ideas could spread in different. So you can see that these ideas can spread, but it's impossible for something to spread with something that went before it. That's impossible. But it's always possible that something more ancient could spread to something that's newer. So we need to think about that whenever we read literature. So if you're interested in studying literature, the knowledge of chronology is very important. It helps you to think about the different writers, what they might know, what they could not know, and it helps you to judge their writing based on what they write about. So for example, in the beginning of the Christian era, the Christian church establishes the doctrine of the Trinity. All right, we established the doctrine of the Trinity in the early Christian church. If somebody lived, let's say somebody lived in Athens when St. Paul was first showing up, and St. Paul lived around 50 or 60 AD, right? 30 years after the founding of the church, we have the life of St. Paul. Here we see St. Peter and Paul were martyred in around 65 AD. So when Paul showed up in Athens and was teaching the people in Athens, and people were becoming Christians in Athens, if a person lived in Athens and became a Christian and never believed in the Trinity, would that person be judged as a heretic because he didn't believe in the Trinity? Yes or no? What do you think? No, the person wouldn't be judged as a heretic because the doctrine was still not developed and taught yet in the church. And that happens at different times through the church. I'll give you another example. You may have heard the teaching that the Virgin Mary was born, and when she was conceived without sin, the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. Thomas Aquinas, who lived around 1200, he didn't teach the Immaculate Conception. He didn't even believe that the Immaculate Conception was necessarily true. And he died around 1274, I think. Thomas Aquinas died and didn't necessarily believe in the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. Is Thomas Aquinas going to be judged for not believing in the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception? Yes or no? What do you think? The answer is no. And the reason why is because, let me ask you this. Do you know when the church actually established the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception? Can you take a guess at when the church established the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception? When do you think? When do you think the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin Mary was established? James guesses 1300s. Nope. You're way too early, James. Comes way later. When was the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception established by the church? 1600s, 1800? Nope. Keep going. It wasn't until the late 1800s, and I can give you one. There's one saint who you should think of. What saint do you think marks the teaching of the Immaculate Conception? Can you think? Yeah, very good, Xavier. Saint Bernadette, all right? Saint Bernadette lived in the 19th century, and remember that the Virgin Mary appeared to her, and what did the Virgin Mary say to Saint Bernadette? What did she tell Saint Bernadette? What did she say to Saint Bernadette? I am the Immaculate Conception. Very good. I am the Immaculate Conception. And that message, let me ask you this. Was Saint Bernadette smart or no? If you know about Saint Bernadette, was she a smart girl? No. She was known as being dumb. She wasn't smart. She wasn't good in school. She was from a poor family. And she received this message from a vision of the Virgin Mary. And the Virgin Mary said, I am the Immaculate Conception. And Saint Bernadette went and told that to her priest. And she had no idea what it even meant. She had no idea what it meant. But the priest, he did know what it meant. And so you can imagine when this girl who's not smart, this poor girl comes and said, someone appeared to me. It was a beautiful woman who appeared to me. And she said, I am the Immaculate Conception. You can imagine when the priest learned that, the priest understood what was important. That doctrine of the Immaculate Conception wasn't even established yet in the church. It was established after Mary appeared to Saint Bernadette. That's what actually led the church to make the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception necessary to be believed. So, did Saint Thomas Aquinas believe in the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception? Yes or no? No, he didn't. Okay. Will Saint Thomas Aquinas be judged for not believing in the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception? No, he won't, because it was established after he died. Will we be judged as Catholics, assuming that many of you are Catholics? I don't know that everyone is a Catholic. That's not my point. But if you are a Catholic living today, are you required to believe in the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception? Yes. And so you can see how important it is to know chronology, right? It's very important to know chronology because you have to know when different teachings were established. Anyone who lived before that wasn't accountable to it. Everyone who lives after that is accountable to it. So even when we judge things that happen in church history, it's very important for us to understand chronology, to know when different things happened, when different things were established by the church, and so on. So again, I think you can see why chronology can become so useful. Anytime that you learn about something, the first thing that you should think about is chronology. You should think, when did this happen? So if I say to you something like, if I say Henry Ford invented the first automobile around 1900. Henry Ford invented the first automobile around 1900. The first thing that you should think about is, well, what do I know about 1900? What do I know about 1900? When Henry Ford invented the first automobile, did he know about the atomic bomb? Yes or no? Did he know about the atomic bomb? No, he didn't know about the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb wasn't dropped until the 1940s, 20 years later. Did Henry Henry Ford, when he invented the car, what were people using for transportation before the car was developed? What were people using for transportation? Horses. Yeah, they some used trains, right, for like longer travel. But every day people were either walking or riding horses. Bikes were kind of fancy. That was sort of a gadget, you know? Like today we have things like, I don't know if you know what like Segway, the Segway scooter things are, or they've got these one-wheeled, they're like skateboards, but they only have one wheel, that kind of stuff. We have like these interesting, people don't really use them, but they're kind of available as a gadget that some people may have. That's what bicycles were like. Bicycles were never really seriously used. They were just sort of like a cool new invention. But do you realize, and think about this, we live in 2023. The automobile was invented around 1920. That's just 100 years ago. Do you realize that people were riding horses as the normal form of transportation just 100 years ago? Just 100 years. So it's only been 100 years that the car has even existed. 100 years ago, people were using horses to get around. So it's very hard for us to realize that, because now, how many of you have ever even ridden on a horse? How many of you have ridden on a horse? Yes or no? Me, I'm guessing me is yes, right? So many people today have never even ridden on a horse. And yet 100 years ago, everyone rode on horses or in carriages, carts pulled by horses, and so on. But when we think about that, we often think like, oh man, that's way, way back. People used horses, long time. And that's not even true. People were using horses 100 years ago. So chronology helps us to think like that. Chronology helps us to realize that automobiles might not be around very long, because it's a new idea. And we already see people trying to end the use of automobiles, right? Henry Ford invented a car with a gas engine. That's only been around for 100 years. You think gas engines are going to be around 100 years from now? Do you think that your grandchildren will be driving cars with gas engines? Yes or no? Probably not, right? We see electric cars are being invented, and that's one idea. We don't know if that's going to last. It may be an interesting idea, but here's something that's really interesting. Let me just think about this with me. Ready? We have cars that are being made to run on electricity. Obviously, our houses run on electricity. Where are we going to get electricity from? When you think about things that people are saying today, where's an important source that people think we're going to get electricity from? Not from outlets. I mean, where is the electricity actually going to come from? The sun, right. So we see people talking about solar energy as being the best way to get electricity in the future, right? So we're thinking about solar panels, people putting solar panels on their roofs. People are talking about making roads out of solar panels. So the whole road is a giant solar panel. You may see places when you drive around, you may see fields that are filled with solar panels. Most people think that we're going to get electricity from the sun. Now think about it. Think about this. Ready? Think about this. Our modern cars no longer are going to use gas and oil. Think about this. Pay attention with me. Our cars are not going to use gasoline to run on. Our cars are going to run on electricity, but the electricity actually comes from the sun. So our cars are really running on sunlight. That's really what the cars would be running on. And this is, we consider this to be very high tech, right? Think about this with me. When people used horses, what fuel did horses run on? What fuel did horses run on? Hay, yeah, hay. They drink water. They don't run on water. They eat hay and grasses, right? How is grass produced? What is the source of the production of grass and hay? The sun. So if you think about it, as technology continues to develop, all we're really doing is going back to where we started from, and we're trying to invent solar-powered vehicles to get around in when God gave us solar-powered vehicles from the very beginning, right? And maybe we're going to make a circle and come around and realize that the horse is actually better than a car. And so we may just make a big circle because we're coming back to solar panel, and every single plant, if you look out the window, if you see something green outside your window, that's a solar panel. That's what plants, that's what leaves are. They're solar panels. God already created solar panels. So where is the technology going to take us? It may just take us right back to where we came from. We don't know, because this has only been around for 100 years. And the whole history of the world lived on simple natural resources: sunlight, plants, animals, and so on. Even trains, when you talk about trains, how did the trains used to run? How did they power trains? Coal. But what was really powering the train? What was they didn't just put coal in and the train ran. What was the train actually running on? Fire, right? That's really what it was. They were just creating fires inside the train, and then they would join, water to the heat of the fire to produce steam, and then they would turn that steam and the pressure of the steam, they would use that to power the train. So it was just fire. The trains were just machines that were powered by fire. And so you see how, even though there's technology, when you think about things with chronology in mind, you realize that these things really aren't that high tech. They're just really fancy ways of doing the same things in different ways. And we don't know if these things are going to last long. They might not even exist in 100 years. When Henry Ford invented the automobile, I'm sure people thought that this was going to last forever. It barely lasted 100 years, and we're already starting to move away from it. So chronology helps us to keep all of this stuff in perspective. Chronology helps us to think about this stuff in a realistic way and not get caught up in new technology and things, because these things might not even exist. We don't know. They've only been around for 100 years. The internet was invented when I was in college. When I was a college student, I started college, there was no internet. When I finished college, we were using the internet in our classes. It's only 30, 40 years old. It hasn't even been around for very long. We have no idea what things are going to be like in 20 years, but they don't necessarily last very long, as we see with the car, with the gas-powered car. So chronology helps us to think about these things, and it causes us to think about things differently than most people think about them, because we can put things in perspective. How long has electricity been in houses? How long has electricity been in houses? Anybody have an idea? How long have houses had electricity? 200 years? You think people had electricity in the 1820s? No, they didn't. No, they didn't. How long? Let me ask you this. If you visit a farmhouse that's, let's say, 100 years old, if you visit a farmhouse that's 100 years old, do you know what an outhouse is? You know what an outhouse is? An outhouse is a building outside where people used to go to the bathroom, right? You know why they used to go to the bathroom in an outhouse? Why did they used to go to the bathroom in the outhouse? They had no toilets. We're talking 100 years ago. 100 years ago, it's not because it didn't smell. They didn't go outside. They went outside because there was no electricity in the house. There was no running water in the house. There were no toilets. There was no drain system in the house. To go to the bathroom, you had to go outside just like your pets, just like you let your dog outside to go. You had to go outside as a person to go to the bathroom. There was no water in the house. There was no sinks. You didn't turn on faucets. You couldn't flush toilets. That was just 100 years ago. 100 years ago. You know, we live out in the country, and there are old farmers around us who grew up in houses that had no running water. They remember when their parents put the first toilets in their house, and they thought it was like the coolest thing in the world. You didn't have to go out to the outhouse in the middle of January anymore and freeze to go to the bathroom. So it's just 100 years old. Just 100 years old. Electricity is so new. You're right. Okay. Your parents, let's take your mothers. If your mothers have to do laundry, how do your mothers do the laundry? What do they do? How do they do laundry? They make us do the laundry. Yeah, maybe. Still, how do you do the laundry? You use a washing machine. You know, your mother grabs a pile of clothes, right? Throws them into a machine, pushes a couple buttons. The laundry machine fills up with water. You just throw some soap in there, hit the button, close the door, and that's it. Mom walks away and goes back out into the other room. How long have women been able to put clothes in the laundry machine? How long have women been able to do that? 50 years? Yeah, think about that. 50 years. No one could ever do that. So if you talk about Saint Bernadette, right? Saint Bernadette lived in the 1800s. Did Saint Bernadette ever put a load of clothes in the washing machine? Ever? No, right? Did John Bosco lived in the 1800s. Did John Bosco ever grab the clothes out of the dryer for his mother? No. Did John Bosco ever walk into a room and flip the lights on so he could study? No, never. These things are 50 years old, 100 years old at the most. So when you look at this chronology timeline, you have to realize that this entire history of the world, no one had electric lights. No one had a washing machine. No one had a car. No one had obviously telephones and things like that. No one had anything like we have. This stuff is 10 years old, 50 years old, 100 years old. And to be a teenager, as most of you are, or at least some of you are, to be born in this generation, can you see how confusing it is for you? Because you can't even imagine life without these things. And so chronology for you becomes very important because it allows you to realize that your experiences are very strange historically. They're very strange. If you want to talk to other kids, all you've got to do is grab a smartphone and you can have a video conversation with a friend who lives in another town. No one could ever do that, ever, ever. In the history of the world, no one could ever do that. If you wrote a letter to a friend, how long did it take for that letter to get to your friend? Days, weeks, months? Can you imagine how difficult it would be to write a letter to a friend and know that you're not going to get an answer to that letter for 2 months? Can you imagine living like that, where information moved that slowly? How could anything, it's hard for us to even imagine how people lived like that. But it's important for you to study chronology and understand how weird your life and experience is. It's very weird. And when you have grandparents complaining that like all you kids do is use the phone and the internet and you're on the computer, you realize that when they were growing up, they didn't even have computers. They never even had a computer. When I was, and I'm not very old, I'm 47 years old. When I was in 7th grade, so I was in 7th grade when my family got our first computer. There was no internet. The computer didn't connect to the internet. It was just a computer. You could type on it and you could print. So I could do a homework assignment and I could print it and then bring the printed paper to school and hand it in. That started when I was in 7th grade. When I was in 5th grade, every single thing we did in school was done with handwriting. Everything, every assignment, our notes, every essay, it was all handwritten. In 7th grade, we were allowed to start turning things in that were printed off a computer. And then, like I said, when I was in college, all of a sudden the internet developed and you could email your friends. We never could do that. We used to use the phone. We would talk to everybody. So if I wanted to get in touch with my friends when I was your age, it would always be by calling them on the phone or getting on my bike and riding to their house to talk to them. That's how we did things. We couldn't just, get on a FaceTime and talk to somebody or call our friend on his cell phone and talk. We couldn't do anything like that. So part of the reason why people criticize kids your age is because they didn't grow up with these things. And it's hard for you to even imagine that your grandparents didn't have these things. And so when they're criticizing and complaining and fussing, they don't understand what it's like to be born into the world where these things have existed your whole life and you've never understood how to live without them. So chronology helps us even to think about ourselves and understand ourselves in history and how unique our experiences are. So my goal today was just to introduce the study of geography and chronology. I think I've made it pretty clear, right, how important these studies are for us to understand not just history, but also the present, right? It's okay, Grace, you can go whenever you're ready, don't worry. The rest of this will be on video if you want to watch it. I'm going to end soon anyway. But you can see how important geography and chronology are. And here's one last thing I want to say. You're going to go into your future work, whatever it may be, whatever kind of work you choose to go into. You could choose to be a religious, you could choose to be married and be a housewife, you could choose to be a business owner, a military, you could choose any future that you want. Chronology helps you to predict what's going to be happening in the next 30 years, because that's when you're going to have to do your work. You're not going to be working today like your mother and father might be. You're not going to be doing things the way I do things. When you start working, you're going to be doing things in 20 years from now, and there's going to be all kinds of changes. So the more that you understand chronology, the better you'll be able to predict what's going to be going on in 10, 20, 30 years. And that can help you to have prudence and make good decisions about what you should study, what kind of work you should do, and so on. So the knowledge of history allows you to predict the future more reliably as well, which can help you in your future career. So that's my introduction to chronology and geography. We'll get started next week going through the first lessons, but that's what I'd like to work with you on, and I think it'll be very helpful. And we'll have time to talk about these things and get into these interesting discussions, which we can't do in a history class because it would just be too messy. So that's all for today. I hope that's helpful. Again, I recorded this, so if you want to watch this again in the future, you can. I'll share the videos, but we're going to study chronology and geography, study history, not just so we can know the past, but also so that we can make wise decisions about the future. So I hope that's helpful. If you got any questions for me today, we can hang out for a bit and chat about them, but otherwise you're free to go, and I'll see you next time. God bless everybody.